The microphone hit the table with a sound that should not have been loud, but somehow echoed through the entire studio like a gunshot, 3,000 miles away, in living rooms and kitchens and office break rooms across America. 57 million people watched the legendary director of Titanic and Avatar stand up, look directly into the camera, and do something no guest had ever done in the 27-year history of The View. He walked away. Not in anger, not with a dramatic flourish or a shouted comeback. Just a quiet, deliberate exit that would ignite a firestorm lasting months and force every artist in America to answer one question. When the world demands you choose between your vision and their approval, which one matters more? But to understand why James Cameron walked off the most watched morning talk show in television history, you have to rewind to the moment when sunshine and small talk turned into something far darker. The morning had started the way every Wednesday morning started at The View's Manhattan studio. Bright lights designed to make everyone look younger than they were. Coffee. Stations positioned strategically near the green room. Production assistants moving with practiced efficiency through hallways that smelled like hairspray and ambition. The kind of controlled chaos that made live television feel spontaneous, even though every camera angle had been mapped. Every commercial break timed to the second, every topic approved by a team of producers who knew exactly how to manufacture conflict that felt real without getting too real. James Cameron arrived at 7:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before his scheduled segment. He wore a simple dark jacket over a black t-shirt, jeans, and practical boots. No flash, no Hollywood glamour. Just the understated presence of a man who had spent 5 decades letting his work speak louder than his wardrobe. At 70 years old, his short silver, white hair was neatly combed, his trimmed silver goatee framing a weathered face that had seen more film sets than most directors would see in 10 lifetimes. His piercing blue eyes carried the intensity that had intimidated studio executives and inspired actors for generations. His publicist, a woman named Sarah Mitchell who had been in the business long enough to develop instincts that bordered on psychic, walked beside him reviewing last-minute details. "They will want to talk about Avatar Fire and Ash," she said, her heels clicking against the polished floor with metronomic precision. Maybe some behind-the-scenes stories about the technology. Keep it light, keep it fun. Joy might ask about the environmental themes. Just give her the standard answer about protecting the planet for future generations. Nothing controversial. In and out in 12 minutes. James nodded, but something in his gut twisted. He had done hundreds of interviews over the past 5 decades. Had watched his films gross more money than any director in history. He had sat across from friendly hosts and skeptical journalists, from entertainment reporters who wanted gossip and film critics who wanted to debate his artistic choices. He knew how to navigate the dance, how to give answers that satisfied without revealing too much, how to promote the film without becoming a lightning rod. But this morning felt different. The air in the building carried a weight he could not name, a tension that had nothing to do with the usual pre-show nerves. Or maybe it was just his imagination, the paranoia that came from knowing that being James Cameron meant someone was always waiting to tear you down. The makeup chair was positioned in front of a wall of mirrors that made the small room feel infinite. An artist named Rebecca worked quickly, dabbing powder across his face, adjusting the lighting to make sure he would not look washed out under the studio's unforgiving brightness. She had done this 10,000 times. Could probably do it blindfolded. And she kept up a steady stream of small talk that was meant to relax him, but somehow had the opposite effect. "Big fan of your work," she said, her brush moving in practiced strokes. "My whole family watched Avatar together. 3 generations in one living room. My dad cried at the end. Said it reminded him of how he used to protect us when we were kids." James smiled, the kind of response that had become automatic after decades of public life. That is good to hear. That is exactly why I make these films. My husband says you are one of the last directors who still believes in family. She continued. Says Hollywood forgot what that word means. But you never did. The words landed differently than she probably intended. Not as encouragement, but as weight, as responsibility, as the burden of representing something to millions of people who would form their entire understanding of his values, based on what they saw in a 12-minute interview. Across the hall in The View's main studio, the five hosts were settling into their pre-show routine. Whoopi Goldberg sat center stage, reviewing her notes with the focused intensity of someone who had been doing live television since before most of the crew was born. Joy Behar occupied the seat to her left, sipping coffee and making jokes with the makeup artist that made everyone in earshot laugh, just a little too hard. Sunny Hostin checked her reflection one more time, adjusted her necklace, smiled at something on her phone. Sarah Haynes stretched her shoulders, rolled her neck, did the small physical rituals that helped manage nerves that never fully went away no matter how many shows you had done. Alyssa Farah Griffin, the youngest and newest host, sat quietly reviewing her talking points, trying to find the balance between fitting in and standing out. The audience filed in with the shuffling excitement of people about to witness something live. Tourists from Ohio and retirees from Florida and college students skipping class for a chance to see celebrities in person. They clutched their coffee cups and whispered to each other about which host was their favorite, which topics they hoped would be discussed, whether they would get picked for the audience participation segment. None of them knew they were about to witness television history. The countdown began. Producers spoke into headsets with voices that carried authority without volume. Camera operators checked their angles one last time. The stage manager held up his hand, fingers extended, counting down in silence. 5, 4, 3, 2. The red light blinked on. Good morning and welcome to The View! Whoopi's voice boomed through the studio with practiced warmth. Her smile bright enough to read as genuine even though everyone knew it was professional. We have an incredible show for you today. Later, we will be talking about the latest political drama coming out of Washington. But first, our next guest is a legend. He has directed two of the highest-grossing films in history. He brought us Titanic, Terminator, and Avatar. Please welcome James Cameron. The applause rippled through the audience, enthusiastic and genuine. James walked onto the set with the easy confidence of someone who had done this dance before. Waving to the crowd, shaking hands with each host, settling into the designated guest chair that felt simultaneously comfortable and like an electric chair waiting to be activated. For the first 6 minutes, everything played exactly as scripted. Questions about filming locations and working with the cast. Anecdotes about the underwater technology that sounded spontaneous, but had been told so many times they had been polished smooth. Laughter in all the right places. Nods of approval. The kind of interview that would get clipped for social media and forgotten by tomorrow. Then Joy leaned forward, her expression shifting from friendly to something sharper, and asked the question that would change everything. So, James, I have to ask about something that has been bothering me. Avatar is this beautiful story about nature and connection. But I noticed something interesting. The entire film revolves around a very traditional family structure. Father, mother, children. No diversity in family representation at all. She paused, letting the words settle like seeds being planted in soil that was about to be set on fire. In 2025, do you think that is a responsible message to send to audiences? That the only valid family is a traditional one? The temperature in the studio shifted, not dramatically. Not obviously, but anyone paying attention could feel it. The way the other hosts sat up slightly straighter. The way the audience went from relaxed to alert. The way James Cameron's piercing blue eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. This was not about the film anymore. This was about his beliefs, his values, everything he had spent 50 years building. And everyone in that studio knew that whatever happened next would determine whether he kept his legacy intact or watched it burn in service to something he considered far more important than approval. The truth. James held Joy's gaze for 3 full seconds before responding. His piercing blue eyes, the same eyes that had stared down studio executives demanding he cut Titanic shorter, the same eyes that had commanded thousands of crew members across dozens of film sets, now focused entirely on the woman who had just questioned the core of everything he believed. "I think," he said slowly, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone who had faced far more intimidating opponents than a morning talk show host, "that I make films about what I believe matters. And I believe family matters. I believe a father protecting his children matters. I believe a mother sacrificing for her family matters. I believe the bond between parents and children is one of the most powerful forces in human existence." He leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Avatar is not a political statement. It is a story about love, about connection, about what we are willing to sacrifice for the people we care about most. If you watched that film, and your first thought was to count which types of families were represented, then perhaps you missed the entire point. The audience stirred. A few people nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that the conversation was drifting into territory that morning television rarely explored. Joy's smile remained fixed, but her eyes glinted with something that looked remarkably like satisfaction. She had gotten him to engage. Now came the real attack. "But James, surely you understand that representation matters. When children watch your films and only see one type of family presented as valid, what message does that send to kids with 2 moms or 2 dads? Are you saying their families are less worthy of being celebrated on screen?" Sunny jumped in immediately, her voice carrying an edge of rehearsed outrage. "It is 2025. We have moved past the idea that there is only one way to be a family. Yet here you are, one of the most influential filmmakers in history, still pushing this outdated narrative. Do you not feel any responsibility to use your platform more inclusively?" James felt the trap closing around him. He recognized it immediately. The same technique he had seen deployed against countless public figures who dared to hold beliefs that contradicted the approved narrative. Frame the question so that any honest answer sounds like bigotry. Make tradition sound like hatred. Force the person to either lie about what they believe or become a villain in the eyes of millions. But James Cameron had not spent 50 years building an empire by backing down from difficult situations. "Let me be very clear about something," he said, his voice dropping lower but somehow carrying more authority. "I do not make films by committee. I do not consult focus groups to determine which demographic boxes to check. I tell stories that come from my heart, my experiences, my beliefs about what makes life meaningful." He paused, letting the words settle over the studio like a blanket being pulled tight. "The Sully family in Avatar represents something I have experienced personally. The bond between Jake and Neytiri, the way they fight to protect their children, the sacrifices they make for each other. That is not a political statement. That is the story I wanted to tell, and I will not apologize for telling it." Whoopi raised her hands, attempting to moderate. "Nobody is asking you to apologize, James. We are just asking whether you think it is fair to only show one perspective when your films reach billions of people." "Fair to whom?" James replied, his blue eyes now blazing with an intensity that made several audience members lean back in their seats. "Fair to the critics, who think every piece of art must serve their agenda. Fair to the people who believe that unless a film includes their specific viewpoint, it should not exist." He shook his head slowly. "I was a truck driver when I started in this business. I had no connections, no wealthy family, no Hollywood friends. I taught myself filmmaking from library books and made my first movie with borrowed equipment and unpaid actors. Nobody gave me anything. I built everything I have through work and sacrifice and believing in stories that mattered to me. His voice grew stronger with each word. And now, after 50 years of creating films that have touched billions of lives, I am supposed to sit here and be lectured about which families are valid enough to appear in my movies by people who have never created anything except controversy. The studio went silent. Joy's face flushed red, not with embarrassment, but with something that looked remarkably like fury. She had expected him to back down, to offer the careful apologies and qualified statements that most public figures deployed when challenged on sensitive topics. Instead, James Cameron had done what James Cameron always did. He had fought back. That is incredibly dismissive. Joy shot back, her voice rising. You are basically saying that your artistic vision is more important than the real harm caused by excluding marginalized communities from representation. I am saying that demanding every artist conform to your ideology is not progress. James replied evenly. It is censorship with better marketing. Sarah Haynes, who had been quiet until now, spoke with genuine emotion trembling in her voice. But James, I have friends who are in same-sex relationships. They have beautiful families, loving children, and when they watch movies like yours and never see themselves reflected, it hurts them. Does that not matter to you at all? James turned to face her directly, and something in his expression softened slightly. It matters to me that every person feels loved and valued. It matters to me that children grow up knowing they are worthy of respect and dignity. But those things do not require me to change the stories I tell. They require all of us to recognize that different artists will tell different stories, and that diversity of perspective means some stories will not include every possible viewpoint. He spread his hands open, a gesture of both explanation and frustration. There are thousands of filmmakers in Hollywood. Some of them make films that celebrate traditional families. Some make films that celebrate non-traditional families. Some make films that challenge the entire concept of family. That is actual diversity. What you are describing is conformity disguised as inclusion. Joy leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. So you are comfortable being on the wrong side of history. You are comfortable knowing that future generations will look back at your films and see them as relics of a less enlightened time. James laughed, not a polite chuckle, but a genuine laugh that carried decades of experience dealing with people who thought they could predict the future. The wrong side of history. That is fascinating. Do you know how many times I have been told I was on the wrong side of history? When I made Terminator, they said science fiction was dead. When I made Titanic, they said 3-hour romances would never work. When I made Avatar, they said audiences would reject the technology. He counted on his fingers with theatrical precision. Every single time, the experts were wrong. Every single time, the people who were absolutely certain about the future turned out to be absolutely wrong. So forgive me if I am not terribly concerned about your predictions regarding which side of history I am on. The audience erupted, half of them applauding loudly, some rising to their feet. The other half sat in stunned silence or shook their heads in visible disapproval. Sonny's face twisted with barely contained anger. You are deflecting. We are not talking about box office predictions. We are talking about basic human decency. We are talking about whether you believe all families deserve to be seen as equal. James met her gaze without flinching. I believe all people deserve dignity and respect. I believe everyone has the right to live according to their own values. And I believe I have the right to tell stories that reflect my values without being told I should be ashamed of them. Joy pounced. So you admit it. You believe traditional families are superior. You believe your values should be imposed on audiences through your films. I said nothing of the kind. James replied, his voice still calm but carrying a dangerous edge. I said I have the right to tell my stories. The same right every artist has. The same right you exercise every day on this show when you share your opinions with millions of viewers. He paused, his piercing blue eyes scanning each host in turn. The difference is that I create. I spend years of my life pouring everything I have into works of art that bring joy and wonder and meaning to people around the world. What do you create besides outrage? The words landed like individual bombs, each one detonating in sequence across the faces of the hosts. Whoopi's expression went rigid. Sunny's mouth dropped open. Sarah looked like she might cry. Joy's face had gone from red to nearly purple. And somewhere in the back of the studio, a producer was frantically signaling to the control booth, trying to figure out how to stop a conversation that had spiraled completely beyond anyone's control. But James Cameron was not finished. Not even close. Joy recovered first, her professional instincts kicking in even as her face burned with barely suppressed rage. Creating outrage, she repeated, her voice dripping with incredulity. We are having a conversation about representation and equality. If that feels like outrage to you, perhaps that says more about your beliefs than our questions. James tilted his head slightly, the way a predator might study prey that had just made an unexpected move. You invited me here to discuss a film about wonder and imagination and the bonds that hold families together. Instead, you ambushed me with loaded questions designed to make me look like a villain for believing what billions of people around the world believe. That is not conversation. That is character assassination with commercial breaks. Whoopi tried again to regain control, her moderator's instincts fighting against the chaos threatening to consume the show. James, I think we can all agree that this conversation has gotten heated. Let us take a step back and find some common ground. Common ground. James leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes sweeping across the panel. What common ground exists between people who want to tell their own stories and people who want to dictate what stories are allowed to be told? He turned to face Whoopi directly. You have been in this industry for decades. You know what it takes to create something meaningful. You know the years of sacrifice, the personal cost, the endless criticism from people who have never risked anything. And now we live in a world where that is not enough. Now artists must also submit their visions for approval by committees who will determine whether our stories are sufficiently aligned with the correct ideology. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but James continued before she could speak. I grew up watching films that showed me worlds I had never imagined. Stories that expanded my understanding of what was possible. Nobody asked whether those films represented every possible perspective. Nobody demanded that every character reflect a demographic checklist. The question was simple. Is this story true? Does it move us? Does it make us feel something real? His voice grew quieter, but somehow more powerful. That is the question I ask when I make a film, not whether it will satisfy critics who view every piece of art through the lens of identity politics, not whether it will generate the right amount of representation points, just whether it tells a truth that matters. Sunny shook her head, her expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. But whose truth, James? Your truth, the truth of wealthy white men who have dominated Hollywood for a century. What about the truths of people who have been systematically excluded from these conversations? James met her challenge without hesitation. I was not born wealthy. I was not connected. I grew up in a small town in Canada, the son of an electrical engineer. I worked as a truck driver to pay rent while I taught myself everything I know about filmmaking. The first movie I directed, I was fired from because the producers thought I was too difficult to work with. He held up his weathered hands, the hands that had held cameras and edited film, and fought for every frame of every movie he had ever made. These hands built everything I have. Not privilege, not connections, not the right background or the right politics, just work. just believing in stories when nobody else did, just refusing to give up when every expert told me I was wasting my time. Sarah Haynes spoke softly, genuine confusion in her voice. Nobody is denying your accomplishments, James. We are just asking whether those accomplishments come with a responsibility to be more inclusive. Responsibility to whom? James replied. To the Twitter accounts that will rage for 3 days and then move on to the next target. To the academic theorists who have never created anything but will happily explain why everything others create is problematic. To the cultural gatekeepers who believe they have the right to determine which stories deserve to exist. He shook his head slowly. My responsibility is to the story. To the audience who pays their hard-earned money to escape into a world I created. To the craft of filmmaking that I have devoted my entire life to mastering. That is where my responsibility lies, not to ideological compliance. Joy's patience had clearly reached its breaking point. She leaned forward, her finger jabbing toward James with the kind of gesture that belonged in a courtroom rather than a morning talk show. You know what I hear when you talk. I hear someone who has had so much success that he thinks the rules do not apply to him anymore. I hear someone so insulated by wealth and fame that he cannot understand why ordinary people might want to see themselves reflected in the stories that shape our culture. James remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. And you know what I hear when you talk? He replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I hear someone who has confused criticism with contribution, who believes that tearing down what others build is somehow equivalent to building something yourself. The audience gasped. Several people covered their mouths. A woman in the front row whispered something to her neighbor that was probably not complimentary. Joy's face went pale, then red, then a shade somewhere between fury and disbelief. How dare you, she breathed. How dare you come on this show and insult us for asking legitimate questions about your work? Legitimate questions. James laughed, but there was no humor in it. You asked whether I feel responsible for harming children by showing a traditional family in my film. You implied that my artistic choices are causing psychological damage to marginalized communities. You accused me of being on the wrong side of history for telling a story about a father who loves his children. He stood up slowly, and the movement sent a ripple of tension through the entire studio. Those are not legitimate questions. Those are accusations disguised as curiosity. Attacks wrapped in the language of concern. Whoopi rose as well, her hands extended in a calming gesture. James, please, sit down. We can discuss this like reasonable adults. We stopped being reasonable adults the moment your colleague suggested I should be ashamed of my beliefs. James replied, his piercing blue eyes now fixed on Joy with an intensity that made her unconsciously lean back in her chair. I never said that, Joy protested. I simply asked whether you feel comfortable with your choices given the current cultural moment. The current cultural moment. James repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. What a remarkable phrase. As if there is a correct way to think that changes with the calendar. As if beliefs I have held for 70 years are suddenly invalid because the cultural moment has declared them obsolete. He took a step toward the exit, then stopped. I have spent 5 decades creating worlds that never existed before, telling stories that moved billions of people to tears and laughter and wonder, building technology that transformed what was possible in cinema. And none of that matters to you. What matters is whether I have the correct opinions, whether I have submitted to the orthodoxy of the current cultural moment. Alyssa, who had been silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke. James, I think what my colleagues are trying to say is that influence comes with responsibility. When you have the platform you have, your choices send messages whether you intend them to or not. James turned to face her, and something in his expression shifted. Not softer, exactly, but more thoughtful. You are the youngest person on this panel. he said. So let me give you some advice that took me decades to learn. The people who tell you that your art must serve their agenda are not your friends. They are not interested in your success. They are interested in your compliance. He paused, making sure she was listening. The moment you start creating to satisfy critics rather than to express truth, you have already lost. You might still make money. You might still win awards. But you will have sacrificed the only thing that makes art worth creating: authenticity. Joy seized on the moment to attack again. Authenticity. You call excluding entire communities from your narratives authentic. You call ignoring the reality of modern families authentic. James did not even turn to face her. I call telling my truth authentic. I call refusing to bend my vision to satisfy people who will never be satisfied authentic. I call creating something beautiful and meaningful despite the endless chorus of voices telling me what I should believe and what I should say authentic. Now, he turned, and his final words to Joy landed with the weight of 5 decades of experience behind them. What do you call authentic? Reading prepared questions designed to generate controversy, performing outrage for ratings, attacking guests who dare to disagree with the approved narrative. The studio had gone completely silent. Even the audience seemed afraid to breathe. And then Joy made the mistake that would change everything. The mistake that would send James Cameron walking off the set and into viral infamy. The words that would divide a nation. You know what, James? Joy said, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. I think we have heard enough. Your views are problematic. They are harmful. And frankly, they have no place in civilized society. The fact that you have this platform while holding these beliefs is offensive. You should be ashamed of yourself. The words hung in the air like poison, and James Cameron smiled. But it was the saddest smile anyone in that studio had ever seen. James reached down and unclipped his microphone. The small mechanical click of the release echoed through the studio sound system, amplified by proximity mics positioned throughout the set. It was a tiny sound, barely noticeable under normal circumstances. But in the charged silence that had fallen over the studio, it registered like a thunderclap. The hosts froze. Whoopi's hand stopped mid-gesture. Joy's mouth opened slightly in genuine surprise. Sunny leaned forward as if she could not quite believe what she was witnessing. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands. Even Alyssa, who had tried to remain neutral, stared with undisguised shock. James placed the microphone on the coffee table between himself and the hosts with deliberate care. The kind of gentleness that made the action more powerful than if he had slammed it down in anger. When he looked up, his expression carried no fury, no defensiveness, just a quiet clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing and why. I did not come here to be ambushed, he said, his voice calm, but carrying through the studio without amplification. Every mic on set picked it up, transmitted it to millions of homes across the country. I came to talk about a film that celebrates family and wonder, and the bonds that hold us together. If you wanted to debate ideology, you should have invited me to a different kind of program. If you wanted to attack my beliefs, you could have done that without pretending this was going to be a friendly conversation. Joy found her voice first, attempting to maintain control through sarcasm. Oh, you are really going to walk off because we asked you tough questions? Because we challenged your outdated worldview? James stood slowly, with the same grace that had characterized his entire public life, the same dignity that had allowed him to face down studios and critics and doubters for 50 years without ever losing himself. He straightened his jacket with a small gesture, looked directly at Joy, and spoke words that would be replayed millions of times over the coming weeks. Real journalists do not ambush their guests. Real journalists do not use their platform to tell people they should be ashamed for believing what most of humanity has believed throughout history. I am not surprised by your reaction. I have seen it before. The assumption that anyone who disagrees with you must be silenced, shamed, destroyed. He paused, his piercing blue eyes sweeping across the panel one final time. But I refuse to participate in my own destruction. I have spent 70 years building a life based on hard work and creativity and staying true to what I believe. I am not going to throw that away to satisfy people who have already decided I am the enemy. Whoopi stood as well, her professionalism fighting against genuine shock. James, please sit down. We can continue this conversation like adults. Nobody is trying to destroy you. He smiled again. That same sad smile that seemed to hold decades of wisdom and disappointment. No, I do not think we can. Because this stopped being a conversation the moment your colleague decided my beliefs were shameful rather than simply different. I respect your right to disagree with me. I respect your right to think I am wrong about everything. But I do not respect being told I should be ashamed of who I am and what I believe. He moved toward the exit, not rushing, but not hesitating either. Each step deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of a decision made not in anger, but in absolute certainty. The cameras followed him instinctively, capturing every angle of what would become the most viral moment in morning television history. Sonny's voice rose above the stunned silence, sharp with indignation. This is incredibly disrespectful. You are walking off our show because you cannot handle being challenged. James turned back, and for just a moment, his composure cracked enough to show the grief underneath. Not grief for himself. Grief for what this moment represented. The unbridgeable divide that had opened up in a culture he had spent his life trying to unite through stories. I am walking off because you are not challenging me. You are condemning me. There is a difference. He continued toward the exit, his silver hair catching the studio lights, his weathered face set with determination. Sarah called after him, her voice breaking. James, please. But he did not stop, did not look back, just kept walking with his shoulders straight and his head high, while behind him the studio descended into barely controlled chaos. Joy's voice cut through, shrill with vindication. Well, there you have it, folks. When confronted with the truth, just walk away. Very mature behavior from someone who wants us to believe his movies have something meaningful to say. James paused at the edge of the stage, hand on the door frame, and turned back one final time. The lighting caught his face in perfect profile, and every camera in the studio captured the moment with cinematic clarity. Fitting, perhaps, for a man who had spent his life understanding exactly how to frame a shot. I have created worlds that never existed, he said quietly. I have told stories that moved billions of people. I have pushed the boundaries of what cinema can achieve. And I did all of that by trusting my vision, not by seeking approval from people who would never give it anyway. His piercing blue eyes found Joy's one last time. You asked if I am comfortable being on the wrong side of history. Let me tell you something about history. It is written by people who create, who build, who dare to imagine something new and then sacrifice everything to bring it to life. It is not written by people who sit in comfortable chairs and criticize from the safety of a television studio. Then he was gone, disappearing through the studio doors into the bright hallway beyond, leaving behind a set that had transformed from polished morning television into something that felt like the aftermath of an explosion. For 5 full seconds, no one moved. The audience sat frozen between reactions. The hosts stared at each other with expressions ranging from triumph to horror to complete bewilderment. Camera operators held their shots, not sure where to point their lenses now that the subject had literally left the building. Whoopi recovered first, her decades of live television experience kicking in like muscle memory. She turned to the camera, her face a mask of professional composure that could not quite hide the shock underneath. We will be right back. The red light on the main camera died, and the moment it did, the studio exploded into motion and noise. Producers rushed onto the set, their voices overlapping in urgent consultation with the hosts. The audience buzzed with conversation that ranged from supportive to outraged, small arguments breaking out between people who had been sitting peacefully next to each other just minutes before. Joy slumped back in her chair, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her water glass. Did that just happen? Did he actually just walk off? Sunny looked like she wanted to throw something. He is going to play the victim now. He is going to go on conservative media and claim we attacked him for no reason. Watch. By tonight he will be a martyr. Did we attack him? Alyssa asked quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation ended. Maybe not in the way you think, but that is exactly what happened. He came here to talk about a movie, and we turned it into an interrogation about his personal beliefs. Whoopi's head snapped toward her. Do not you dare defend what just happened. He came on our show and expressed harmful viewpoints. He expressed viewpoints you disagree with. Alyssa countered, her voice still quiet but firm. We did not like his answers. So we told him he should be ashamed, and he refused to accept that shame. That is what just happened. The argument would have continued, but Richard, the floor manager, interrupted with his voice tight with barely controlled panic. We are back in 90 seconds. I need to know what we are doing. Whoopi straightened her notes with hands that were not quite steady. We continue. We address what happened. We explain why it was necessary. And we move on. But everyone in that studio knew nothing was moving on from this. Not today. Not this week. Probably not for months. Because somewhere out there, the clip was already being uploaded, shared, reshared, exploding across every platform with the kind of velocity that only genuine controversy could achieve. The countdown began again. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked back on, and America watched as 5 women tried to explain what had just happened without quite being able to explain it themselves. Meanwhile, in a car pulling away from the studio, James Cameron sat in the back seat with his phone, already buzzing with calls he was not ready to answer. He watched the Manhattan skyline slide past the window and wondered if he had just ended his legacy or finally started living it honestly. His publicist Sarah sat beside him, her face pale, her tablet already filling with notifications. James, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What did you just do? He turned to look at her, and for the first time since the interview began, he smiled. A real smile. The smile of a man who had finally stopped pretending. I told the truth, Sarah. I just told the truth. By the time the car reached James's apartment in Lower Manhattan, the clip had been viewed over 30 million times. His phone, which he had turned face down on the seat beside him, vibrated with such persistent urgency that it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Sarah Mitchell had stopped trying to brief him on the media coverage. The numbers were changing too fast to keep track of. Every refresh brought new millions of views, new thousands of comments, new waves of both condemnation and support crashing against each other like opposing tides. Robert Davidson, the producer of Avatar, had called 12 times. Studio executives at Fox had left messages ranging from panic to furious. Entertainment journalists were already writing think pieces with titles that would dominate social media for weeks. James ignored all of it. He walked through his building's lobby, past the doorman who pretended not to notice that his most famous resident had just become the most talked about person in America, and took the elevator to his floor in silence. Sarah followed, her tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. James, we need to talk about damage control. The studio wants a statement. The press wants interviews. There are already sponsorship concerns for the next Avatar film. We need to get ahead of this before it spirals completely out of control. He unlocked his apartment door and stepped inside without responding. The space was modest by Hollywood standards. Comfortable but not extravagant. Bookshelves lined with screenwriting manuals and oceanography texts. Models of submarines and deep, see vehicles scattered across surfaces. The home of a man more interested in ideas than impressions. James walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Millions of people going about their lives, most of them unaware that a conversation on a morning talk show had just drawn a line through the culture that would take years to heal. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice tired but steady. "What exactly would you have me say?" She stepped closer, her professional composure beginning to crack. "Something that acknowledges the pain caused by your comments. Something that shows you understand why people are upset. Something that gives everyone an off-ramp from this confrontation." "An off-ramp?" James repeated the phrase as if tasting something bitter. "You want me to apologize for believing what I believe, so that people who hate me anyway will temporarily pretend they do not." "I want you to survive this," Sarah replied, genuine fear creeping into her voice. "I have been in this business for 25 years. I have seen careers destroyed over far less than what happened today. You are not invincible, James. Nobody is." He turned to face her, and the afternoon light caught his silver hair, his weathered face, his piercing blue eyes that had seen so much triumph and so much struggle over 7 decades. "Do you know why I became a filmmaker, Sarah?" She shook her head, momentarily thrown by the change in direction. "Because I wanted to create worlds where truth still mattered, where courage meant something, where people could escape the smallness of their lives and remember what it felt like to believe in something bigger than themselves." He moved away from the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I spent 50 years building those worlds. Titanic was not just a disaster movie. It was about love that transcended death. Terminator was not just science fiction. It was about the choices that define our humanity. Avatar was not just special effects. It was about connection, family, the bonds that hold us together when everything else falls apart." His voice grew stronger. "And now you want me to apologize for that? For believing that those things matter? For refusing to pretend that my values are negotiable just because someone with a microphone decided they should be?" Sarah's tablet buzzed again. She glanced at it reflexively, then looked back at James with an expression that had shifted from fear to something more complicated. "The numbers are still climbing," she said quietly. 70 million views now. And James, the reaction is splitting right down the middle. Half the country thinks you are a hero. The other half thinks you are a monster. "That sounds about right," James replied. "That is what happens when you tell the truth in a world that has forgotten how to hear it." His laptop sat on the kitchen counter, the screen dark. When he touched the trackpad, it illuminated to show an email inbox overflowing with messages. Thousands of them. Subject lines that ranged from threatening to grateful, from furious to tearful. He scrolled through them without responding, watching the flood of human emotion pour across his screen. Then one email caught his attention. The subject line read simply, "From someone who needed to hear what you said." He clicked it open. "Dear Mr. Cameron," the message began. "My name is Nathan Brooks. I am 24 years old. I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma where everyone knew everyone and nobody talked about anything that might make people uncomfortable. I have spent my entire adult life being told that my beliefs are wrong, that the values my parents taught me are outdated, that the way I was raised belongs in the past. I went to college and learned very quickly that expressing traditional views about family or faith or anything else would make me a target. So I stayed quiet. I learned to keep my head down and my mouth shut. I got a degree. I got a job. I built a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow from within, because I had learned that being honest about who I am would cost me everything. Then I watched your interview today. I watched you sit across from people who were clearly trying to destroy you, and instead of backing down, instead of apologizing, instead of giving them what they wanted, you stood up. You told them that your beliefs were not negotiable. You refused to be ashamed of who you are. And then you walked away. Mr. Cameron, I cannot tell you what that moment meant to me. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe I was not crazy. Maybe my values were not something to hide. Maybe there were other people out there who believed what I believed, but had just been too afraid to say it. You probably do not realize this, but you gave millions of people permission today. Permission to stop pretending. Permission to stop apologizing. Permission to stand up for what we believe even when it costs us everything. Thank you for being brave enough to be honest. Thank you for showing us what it looks like to refuse to bend. With gratitude, Nathan Brooks. James read the email 3 times. Each pass brought something closer to the surface. Not tears, exactly. He had cried plenty over 70 years. This was something different. Something that felt like vindication and grief, and hope all tangled together in a knot that would take time to unravel. Sarah had been reading over his shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. That is one email, James. One person out of millions. What about all the others who are saying you drove them away? What about the damage this might do to the franchise, to your legacy, to everything you have built? He turned to face her. Should I have lied to make them comfortable? Should I have told them that I believe whatever they want me to believe? Because that is not who I am. Sarah, that has never been who I am. Before she could respond, his phone rang with a call he could not ignore. Robert Davidson, his producer, the man who had helped him bring Avatar to life over more than a decade of collaboration. James answered on speaker. Robert. James. The voice on the other end carried tension, but also something else. Something that sounded almost like excitement. Are you sitting down? Standing, actually. What is happening? What is happening is that our streaming numbers have exploded. Avatar viewership is up 90% in the last 4 hours. The merchandise website crashed twice from traffic. We have received more social media engagement today than in the entire previous quarter combined. Sarah's eyebrows shot up. James felt something shift in his chest. What are you saying? I am saying that the conventional wisdom was wrong. The people who predicted disaster, the executives who wanted you to apologize immediately, they were all wrong. The audience, the real audience, the millions of people who watch your films because they are hungry for stories that mean something, they are rallying. They are not running away from this. They are running toward it. Robert's voice strengthened with each word. Because finally, someone refused to apologize for making art that celebrates what they believe in. Someone stood up and said that their vision was not subject to approval by people who have never created anything. You gave them something they have been starving for, James. Authenticity, courage, the willingness to be hated for telling the truth. James closed his eyes for a moment, processing words he had not expected to hear. So what happens now? Now we make the best film we have ever made. Now we stop playing it safe. Now we tell the story we actually want to tell, without worrying about whether it checks the right boxes or satisfies the right critics. Robert paused. You did not just survive today, James. You started something, and I intend to see it through with you. The call ended, and Sarah stared at her tablet with an expression of complete disbelief. The numbers are still climbing, she whispered. And the support is overwhelming the criticism. I have never seen anything like this. James walked back to the window, looking out at the city that had watched him triumph and struggle for 5 decades. Neither have I, he said quietly. Neither have I, but somewhere deep inside, in the place where artists kept the truths they rarely spoke aloud, he knew exactly what had happened. He had bet everything on honesty. And for once, honesty had won. 6 months passed like a river finding new channels after a dam breaks. The View never invited James Cameron back. Behar made occasional jokes about him during segments. usually met with applause from their studio audience, but increasingly met with silence from viewers who had watched the original clip and wondered if perhaps the reaction had been disproportionate to what he had actually said. The ratings bump from the controversy proved temporary, but the cultural impact echoed far longer than anyone anticipated. A university professor in Boston included the clip in her media ethics course, asking students to analyze both James's approach and the host's response. Youth leaders showed it at conferences about standing firm in your convictions. Critics used it as evidence of Hollywood arrogance. Supporters used it as evidence of media hostility toward traditional values. The moment had become a mirror, revealing more about those who watched it than about the event itself. James's mainstream television appearances dropped significantly. Talk shows that once competed for his interviews now passed without explanation. Awards ceremonies that previously celebrated his technical innovations quietly removed him from presenter lists. But smaller doors opened. Unexpected doors. Film festivals focused on family values invited him as a keynote speaker. Universities with traditional orientations offered honorary degrees. Podcast hosts who valued substance over sensationalism requested long-form conversations that attracted millions of listeners hungry for depth in an age of sound bites. A life that looked smaller by Hollywood standards somehow felt larger in the ways that actually mattered. 8 months after the interview, James received another email that would stay with him forever. It came from a woman named Emily Carter, whose name he did not recognize, but whose story would reshape how he understood the impact of that single morning. Dear Mr. Cameron, the message began. I was in the view audience the day you walked off. I was one of the people who booed you. I thought you represented everything wrong with the entertainment industry, everything that had made people like me feel invisible and unwelcome for so long. I went home that day feeling vindicated, feeling like you had been exposed as exactly what I suspected you were, a rich old man clinging to outdated beliefs because he had never been forced to question them. But I could not stop thinking about what you said, about how creating something beautiful does not require permission from critics, about how art should express truth rather than seek approval, about how the people who demand conformity are rarely the ones who build anything worth remembering. And I realized I had spent my entire career doing exactly what I accused you of refusing to do, playing it safe, checking boxes, making sure my work satisfied everyone while inspiring no one. I am a writer, Mr. Cameron, or at least I wanted to be. I spent 10 years in publishing, learning all the rules about what stories were acceptable and which perspectives were allowed. I became very skilled at producing content that offended nobody and moved nobody. After watching your interview, I quit my job. I started writing the story I had always wanted to tell. A story about my grandmother, who raised 7 children alone after my grandfather died, who held our family together through poverty and prejudice and loss. A story about traditional love, traditional sacrifice, traditional values that the publishing world had taught me were no longer relevant. My book was rejected by 14 agents before one finally took a chance. It was published 6 months ago to almost no fanfare, no major reviews, no bestseller lists, no cultural moment. But last week I received a letter from a woman in rural Tennessee who said my book was the first time she had ever seen her own mother's story reflected in literature. That reading it made her feel like her family's struggles had mattered, that someone had finally noticed the quiet heroism of ordinary people living ordinary lives with extraordinary love. That letter meant more to me than any bestseller list ever could. You probably do not realize this, but you gave me permission to fail, permission to create something true instead of something safe, permission to trust my own vision instead of waiting for approval from people who would never give it. Thank you for walking away. It taught me that sometimes the bravest thing an artist can do is refuse to participate in their own diminishment. With gratitude, Emily Carter. James saved the email in a folder alongside Nathan Brooks's message and dozens of others like them. These were the voices that mattered, the quiet testimonies that would never trend on social media or generate headlines, but represented something more valuable than any amount of cultural approval. The transformation they whispered about. 1 year after the interview, James stood on a stage in Austin, Texas, addressing a crowd of young filmmakers who had paid significant money to hear him speak. The venue held 2,000 people, and every seat was filled. He looked out at their faces, so young, so hungry, so terrified of making the same mistakes their predecessors had made, yet equally terrified of the consequences of doing something different. They told me walking off the view would end my career. He began, his voice carrying through the auditorium with 5 decades of authority behind it. They told me that standing firm on my beliefs would make me unemployable, that the culture had moved past people like me and I needed to either adapt or disappear. He paused, letting the words settle. They were half right. Some doors did close. Some opportunities did vanish. Some people who once celebrated my work now pretend it does not exist. But here is what they did not tell me. Other doors opened. Unexpected doors. Doors that led to rooms filled with people who were starving for someone to say what they had been too afraid to say themselves. He gestured toward the audience. You are those people. You came here because you want to create something that matters. Something true. Something that will outlast the trends and the algorithms and the endless cycle of cultural approval and disapproval. So, let me tell you the most important thing I have learned in 50 years of making films. His piercing blue eyes swept across the room. The people who tell you that your art must serve their agenda are not your friends. They are not interested in your success. They are interested in your compliance. And the moment you start creating to satisfy them, instead of to express truth, you have already lost the only thing that makes art worth creating. Your authenticity. He stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the edge of the stage. I was a truck driver when I started. No connections, no wealthy family, no path forward except the one I carved myself with borrowed equipment and library books and a refusal to accept that my dreams were impossible. Everything I have built came from trusting my vision when nobody else did, from standing firm when everyone told me to bend, from believing that the stories I wanted to tell deserved to exist, even when the world insisted they did not. That is the only secret I have. The willingness to be hated for telling the truth. The courage to walk away from approval in search of authenticity. The faith that somewhere out there, people are waiting for exactly the story you are afraid to tell. He smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like what he was, a 70-year-old man who had seen more triumph and failure than most people could imagine, standing in front of a room full of dreamers and telling them the only thing that actually mattered. Go tell your stories. The true ones. The difficult ones. The ones that might cost you everything. Because the stories that cost you nothing are worth exactly that much. Nothing. The applause that followed was not polite. It was not obligatory. It was the sound of 2,000 people who had just been given permission to become who they always wanted to be. James Cameron stood in that wave of sound and thought about Joy Behar's question from a year ago, whether he was comfortable being on the wrong side of history. He had his answer now. History was not written by people who sought approval. It was written by people who created despite disapproval, who built despite criticism, who stood firm despite pressure to bend. And sometimes, history was written by people brave enough to unclip a microphone, stand up from a comfortable chair, and walk away from everything that did not matter toward everything that did. James Cameron had made that walk 1 year ago. He had never stopped walking since. And somewhere out there, millions of people were finding the courage to take their first steps on the same path. Because in the end, That was what art was supposed to do. Not seek permission, not demand approval. Just light a fire and trust that the people who needed its warmth would find their way toward it. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you would like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next chapter we are preparing for you.